else is there so much exuberance, love of display, such gaiety in the streets? Where else but Latin America in fiesta time? This is the Latin temperament, ardent, passionate, uninhibited, very different from the reserve of North America. It's a temperament to fill the streets with the noise of carnival. But in a different mood, this temperament can fill these same streets with the noise of rebellion. Latin America, home of the chronic revolution, the fickle mob, the governments that rise and fall so quickly and for such obscure reasons as to baffle the outside world. Why this violence, this instability? What keeps Latin America in such continuous ferment? These are some of the questions we'd like to look into. Latin America. The term covers almost half the Western Hemisphere, an area that divides into four parts. First, the island republics of the Caribbean Sea. Then Mexico on the North American continent. Going south from Mexico, the 6 small republics that make up Central America. Then below this, the great continent of South America. In South America, you find dramatic variations. To start with, a great spine of mountains from north to south, the Andes. Then the savannas of Venezuela and the grasslands of the southeast. Then the Amazon River basin with its jungles. And last, a huge plateau stretching from the interior to the Atlantic. You might begin a tour of Latin America amid the islands of the Caribbean. Here in this medley of island peoples, you'll find Haiti, a republic created by the descendants of slaves. It's unique in the region, for the inhabitants are Negroes and the official language French. Right next door in the Dominican Republic, people speak Spanish, as they do in the nearby contentious island of Cuba. Cuba of yesterday, settled by Spain in the 16th century, was best known to foreigners for its nightclubs and casinos. Havana was a bustling tourist center, in sharp contrast to the hinterland with its sugarcane plantations. In Cuba and many other Latin American countries, a single crop was the mainstay of the economy. On North America's mainland, volcanoes and scenic beauty made Mexico known to the tourists. Luxury resorts draw thousands from the United States and Canada to this most northern of the Latin American republics. But tourist Mexico is very different from the rest of the country, where the struggle to escape from poverty is still the central theme. Yet this is one of the most prosperous of all Latin American states. Mexico's farmers, fishermen, and other workers have a larger share of the national wealth and more to spend on market day than many of their cousins in other Latin countries. The capital city dominates the whole country. Mexico City, the biggest Spanish-speaking city in the world. Population over 4.5 million. Its vitality reflects a dynamic process based on a revolution begun in 1910 and still continuing. In the capital and throughout the country, most of the population is of mixed blood, Indian and Spanish. Even the architecture shows this mixture, as in these Spanish churches built on the ruins of old Aztec temples. The Spaniards conquered Mexico in the 16th century, and churches are part of the heritage they left. But Mexico is also proud of its Indian heritage. The mixture of these two elements, Spanish and Indian, gives the country its distinctive flavor. Southward from Mexico, the Republic of Guatemala. Lake Atitlan, high in the mountains, is one of its beauty spots. Guatemala is one of 6 small countries that make up Central America, most of them relatively poor and undeveloped. Sometimes called the Banana Republics, these are a mixed mosaic of varied populations and forms of government. In most, however, the population is largely Indian. Amid these often primitive surroundings, you'll find a few surprisingly modern cities, signs of wealth. But here, appearances are deceiving. For the economic base of most Central American countries is a shaky one. Proud new buildings may rise, but only a few streets away, the poverty of older times continues. In these small republics, as in all Latin America, there's great contrast between the wealth of the few and the poverty of the many. South again to the shores of the South American continent, to Venezuela. Here you'll find Lake Maracaibo, an enormous sheet of inland water dotted with the derricks of the oil fields. These wells, pumping up a rich supply of petroleum from beneath the lake bed, feed Venezuela with the largest part of its income. For this is one of the world's major sources of supply. Like all Latin American countries, Venezuela needs to develop a more diversified economy, more manufacturers. To some extent, the earnings from oil exports have been used to do this, but there's still a long way to go. Meanwhile, most of the benefits from oil are reaped by the country's capital, Caracas. Oil has made Caracas an ultra-modern, stylish city in a land that's otherwise little developed. The wealth of Caracas doesn't spread far beyond the city. There's a far lower standard in the smaller towns, a far from even distribution of the wealth. To correct this is the greatest task facing the country. Another task is to develop the vast potentials of the interior. Planning, investment, development might yet do wonders. Up to now, this rough and ready hinterland has barely been tapped. Between Venezuela and the Republic of Colombia to the westward, are the high walls of the Andes. Stretching the whole length of South America, they form the world's longest chain of mountains. In Colombia, most people live in the narrow zone between the Andes and the sea. Here you'll find large tracts of fertile farmlands. Rising in the Andes, the Magdalena River flows 1,000 miles down to the Caribbean. The river is the link between the outside world and the towns of the interior. As in most of Latin America, the Indians form a big proportion of the country's people. They're generally poor and illiterate, and their discontents add greatly to the instability of politics. In the uplands of Colombia, seedlings are replanted. These are coffee trees, and their harvest will provide the country with its greatest source of income. Colombia is the world's second biggest coffee producer. In some years, over 8 million bags have been shipped out from the farms of the interior. Coming down from thousands of farms, the coffee beans are dried and ready for export. Colombia's coffee is highly valued abroad and fetches good prices. But with most of the economy based on this single crop, Colombia faces grave hardship in years when the crop is poor or when world markets are depressed. South of Colombia, 3 mountain countries dominated by the Andes: Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia. High mountain valleys and tropical lowlands, as in Ecuador, which exports the world's biggest banana crop. These are lands of tremendous contrast. Tropical forests below, then Lake Titicaca in the cold heights of Bolivia, over 12,000 feet above the sea. On the mountain slopes, valuable crops like the coca plant, source of the potent drug cocaine and supplement to the Indians' scanty diet. And from the bark of the cinchona tree, quinine. In Bolivia, most of the people live on the high plateau, above 12,000 feet. More than half are Indian. Primitive farming gives them a meager yield for hard and thankless work. Towns and cities, too, live at great altitudes in the Andes. One is Cusco in Peru, founded by the Incas, probably before the 13th century. The city is a striking blend of ancient Indian and Spanish cultures, of Catholic churches built on the foundations of pagan temples. La Paz, Bolivia, at 12,000 feet, the highest capital city in the world. In these streets, too, a mixture of Indian and Spanish themes. And also llamas, which furnish milk and meat, wool and leather for this mountain land. The higher reaches of Bolivia's plateau, the Altiplano, are especially desolate, almost barren, treeless, cold, and windswept. And yet for centuries, the Aymara Indians have chosen to make it their home. Above Potosi, another old Bolivian city, mountain mines once yielded $5 million worth of silver every year. The deposits dwindled in the 19th century, yet mining is still Bolivia's first industry. In a few places, operations are as primitive as they were under the Spaniards 400 years ago. But modern methods of mining are much more typical in present-day Bolivia. Minerals still account for over 90% of the country's exports. Copper and gold, lead and zinc, tungsten and antimony are all plentiful. And above all, Bolivia is one of the world's great sources of tin. Workers in Bolivian mines are mostly mestizos of Indian and Spanish blood, having some education and occupying the better jobs. For the Indians, the daily life is one of poverty, subject to the ruling whites and mestizos. In recent years, the Indians have risen in bloody riots and strikes and rebellion. Few countries in South America have been more troubled by conflicts rising from Indian discontent. Southward again to Chile, a narrow land stretching 2,600 miles down the Pacific coast. Along this coastal strip are great differences in climate and landscape, from hot deserts in the north to cool pasture lands in the south. Wool, hides, and meat strengthen Chile's economy, part of the well-developed resources that help to make this one of the more prosperous countries in Latin America. But it's the bleak northern desert with its mines that brings the greatest wealth. Chileans have expanded the sodium nitrate industry to the point where they're the world's greatest exporters of nitrates. These are used in making explosives. Continuing demand, especially during 2 world wars, has greatly boosted the Chilean economy. Another export, copper, has even greater value. Chile is the world's 2nd largest copper producer. Because of these minerals, a large industrial class has grown, and this in turn has helped the steady growth of Chile into a relatively strong, stable, and democratic nation. Across the Andes from Chile, the rivers flow eastward toward the Atlantic, through Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, many of them joining the great river Plata. In Buenos Aires, a famous monument symbolizes the Plata and its role in Argentina's history. The Great Plains, the Pampas, also played their role, and the towering Andes. Buenos Aires, largest city in the world south of the equator. A sophisticated showplace with a flavor more European than American. Throughout Argentina and Uruguay, traditions of many countries mingle. Their populations are descended not only from early Spanish settlers, but also from Italians, Germans, Russians, Poles, and other Europeans. But in Asunción, capital of Paraguay, Indian influence is strongest. In Paraguay, scenes like the Old West of North America 100 years ago. These are the farmlands of German Mennonites, one of several European groups who settled in this remote, landlocked republic. Though old-fashioned in their ways, the industrious Mennonites did much to open up the vast area of the Chaco. Their simple life is a sharp contrast to the great ranches of neighboring Argentina, with their gauchos and herds of pedigreed horses. On the great Argentine estates, palatial splendor and a gracious way of life. It suggests how much wealth has been acquired by some of the cattle ranchers. Here, and almost everywhere in Latin America, most of the land is still in the hands of a very small group of owners. In Paraguay, air transport helps to overcome great distances in the cattle country, where roads and railways hardly exist. Nor is there much provision for law and order. A pistol on the hip has its uses. For want of telephones, a hand-crank radio keeps contact with the world outside. Cattle raising has built much of the wealth of Argentina and Uruguay, and it's important to Paraguay, a much poorer and less developed country. Hides are a valuable export, as well as meat. From the ports of the River Plata, they go abroad to earn much-needed foreign exchange. Towering above Rio de Janeiro, a massive Christ looks down on one of South America's biggest, most beautiful, and most exciting cities. For Rio dominates the life of this Portuguese-speaking country that covers half the continent and numbers half its population. The vibrant life of Rio draws tourists by the thousands. At famous Copacabana Beach, tourists from abroad mingle with Brazilians of the growing middle class who have money and leisure for the good life. In Brazil, many races live and work together. The early colonists from Portugal intermarried with Indians and Negro slaves, and later many of Europe's nationalities were added to the mixture. The result today is perhaps the world's best example of a truly interracial society. Sao Paulo, Brazil's metropolis, is the world's fastest-growing city, an industrial center, a dynamic society, a glittering symbol of optimism. But the boom has not been an unmixed blessing. It has brought severe inflation, Brazil's most crippling problem. Cheerful-looking children, but they live in squalor. For as the cities grow, so do the slums. With the birth rate soaring, there seems little hope for the teeming poor. And yet, the vast, empty hinterland is still unpopulated. Most of Brazil, in fact, is almost unpopulated. A great expanse of jungle and forest where only a few Indian tribes make their home. Civilization has barely touched them. These people live virtually in the Stone Age. But there are resources here in the wilderness, like native rubber trees, and to some extent these are exploited. Here, deep in the Amazon jungle, latex is gathered and then heated and thickened into rubber over the fire. When they're ready, the 200-pound balls of rubber roll down to the banks of the Amazon to begin their long journey to market. Perhaps a journey of 2,000 miles. Meanwhile, on other tributary rivers, other sources of wealth are brought to light. Gold and diamonds. The huge interior region may hold many resources besides diamonds and rubber. Already, it holds the astonishing new city called Brasilia. Brasilia is literally in the middle of nowhere, yet it's the country's new capital, replacing Rio de Janeiro. For more than 100 years, Brazilian planners had called for an inland capital to draw attention from the crowded coast toward the vast interior. But only in the late 50s did building begin. Extravagant, a reckless dream, its critics say. Now a bold and daring plan is reflected in bold and daring architecture. This city, like Brazil itself, defies all predictions. Brasilia, in many ways a symbol of urgent striving in modern Latin America. In many parts of Latin America are relics of ancient cultures that came before the Spaniards and the Portuguese. Deep in the jungles of Guatemala are ruins telling of a highly sophisticated Indian civilization. These people, the Mayans, left scientific instruments and inscriptions that show an astonishing knowledge of mathematics and astronomy. Far to the south, in Peru, another advanced society flourished, that of the Incas, who built great fortresses and cities. 30 different Indian cultures have risen in Peru. Today, the Incas' culture has gone, but their descendants still remain high in the Andes. In Bolivia, a ritual dance by Aymara Indians. These people, like the Incas who ruled over them 4 centuries ago, were crushed by the onslaught of the Spanish conquerors. For Spain destroyed the Indian civilizations that she conquered. It all began in 1492. Columbus, as we know so well, left Spain and sailed westward across the unknown Atlantic. He hoped to find a new route to the Orient. Instead, he found a new world in America. There were riches here, some of which could be had peacefully, but more often than not, they had to be fought for. And in the process, the conquistadores who followed Columbus wiped out the ancient civilization of the Indians. In their new settlements on the seacoast, the Spaniards set to work with vigor. In a few years, their colonies spread over thousands of miles. From mines and smelters came a stream of silver and gold, precious metals to pay the costs of empire. Later on, from Africa, slaves were brought for sale to the colonists. Most of the slaves came to the Spanish islands in the Caribbean and to Brazil, which the Portuguese had settled. Now, with slave labor, these areas could grow agriculturally. Plantations arose and prospered with their crops of sugar, cotton, and tobacco. All over Latin America, Spanish cities and towns sprang up, more than 200 of them, within the century after Columbus. It was a rate of growth probably unparalleled in all the history of colonization. And it would continue, inland from the coastal regions, as explorers followed up the rivers and pushed into the interior past mountains and jungles. To rule their vast empire in the New World, the Spaniards set up a highly efficient system of administration. Viceroys, appointed by the kings of Spain and answerable only to them, ruled with almost absolute authority. Below the viceroys came a complex hierarchy of lesser officials in charge of the different regions. Though distances were great and transport difficult, the system worked well. But it was authoritarian, autocratic, giving the people almost no voice in the conduct of affairs. Thus, when the Spanish colonies won independence in the 19th century, they had little experience of self-government or democracy. After 300 years of rule, Spain had left them a civilization, but also a political vacuum. This vacuum invited revolutions and dictatorships that have plagued Latin America right to the present day. About 150 years ago, the Wars of Independence broke out. After bitter struggle, the Latin Americans broke free from their masters. But doing so, they raised new problems for themselves. Now the old, stable, central authority was gone. Also, a region formerly unified was broken up in fragments, republics that would war among themselves for long years to come. In Mexico, a church built on the ruins of an old Indian temple. In Guatemala, in another Roman Catholic church, present-day Indians are worshiping. But here, in a mixture of Spanish and Indian traditions, the Indians still perform old pagan rites on the steps outside the church, facing the market square. In Latin America, the church worked powerfully to unify Spain's colonial empire. Church and state worked together. Zealous missionaries came with the conquistadores to convert the Indians after they were conquered. The church not only spread religion, it was also teacher and educator. In this role, it strengthened the conservative, authoritarian side of Spanish rule. Church and state, between them, resisted change. Some of this attitude from colonial times survives today. Resisting change means that backwardness and poverty remain. Backwardness and poverty. You see them in each country, on little farms everywhere in Latin America. The farms are too small, the methods of work too primitive, and life more often than not is hard and mean. Yet amid this poverty, the birth rate rises steadily. More and more mouths to share the meager harvest coming from pitifully small farms. In Latin America, 10% of the owners still hold about 90% of the land. Huge estates for the rich, tiny plots for the poor. In no other part of the world is there such a large area where land distribution is so grossly unequal. In Brazil, the rains have failed to come. The fields lie parching in the sun. Farmers and their families wait. Days pass, but there is no relief. And finally, their last hopes are gone, and they know there will be no crop at all this season. On the coffee plantations, a rich harvest, but the picture can change very quickly. The next crop may be hit by devastating blight. The farmers learn that all the coffee trees in their district have been affected by the blight. Nothing can be done. It's a familiar story in Latin America. Sometimes a whole country depends on virtually one crop. When that crop fails, there's nothing to fall back on. There below is a modern city. Also there are squalid slums beneath the walls of glass and concrete. The slums keep growing, for they're the refuge of people who have been crushed by the hopelessness of life on the land. They flock to the cities, looking for opportunities. But mostly, there are no opportunities, only a marginal life in squatters' shacks. In Rio de Janeiro, a hearse receives a little coffin. In the slums, without sanitation, disease is rampant. Poverty in city slums, poverty on the farms. In the faces of the poor, disillusion and despair. These days, in many parts of Latin America, new demands are being heard. People feel the old hardships have gone on long enough. Passive acceptance has gone on long enough. Now there are demands. Better housing, for instance, in the city and the village. There's some progress, certainly, but many countries of Latin America have barely scratched the surface of their social problems. So the demands are growing. Demands for simple things, like a solid roof, a dry floor, electric light. Demands for space enough to live with decency and privacy. Space, quiet, air, and light for every family. Besides the family's requirements are community requirements, like roads and electricity. Good water supplies and proper sewage systems to fight disease and give the new generation a chance of good health. New model communities like this are all too few. Many more are needed before the squalor is replaced by decent living and hopes for a brighter future. Above all, Latin America wants education. Without it, there's no real progress. Much of the region's backwardness comes from the fact that 70 or 80 million people in the area cannot read or write. Montevideo, Uruguay, 1960. Delegates from 7 Latin American countries would sign a treaty establishing a common market like that of Western Europe. The treaty called for gradual reduction of tariff barriers to enlarge the regional markets for struggling industries. This could mean a great economic step ahead. Meanwhile, in the hinterland, some of the countries were beginning to take a closer look at their own potential resources. Surveys were made, probing deep into wild and unfamiliar country. First, you must discover what is there, then find a way to get to it. Building an airstrip in the middle of a jungle costs money, but maybe there's no other way to bring in machinery and tap a rich potential deposit of minerals or of oil. Bridges, paved roads, railways, airways, all are needed. It means construction work in some of the world's most difficult terrain. It means modern bridges over rivers and gorges that have known only the most primitive crossings. Opening up the great interior spaces of South America. This is work as hopeful and exciting as it was in North America a century ago. The grandeur of the Andes, seen from one of the world's loftiest railways. Building a line like this entails enormous cost. Raising capital is a major task for governments to undertake. Without capital, there's no new transport, no bringing out of new resources, no new wealth to finance the urgent social needs of every country. In the snows of the high Andes lies a rich resource. Here above a river in Chile, hydrometric surveyors measure the rate and volume of the water's flow. And from this, they'll estimate the river's potential for hydroelectric power. Latin America is blessed with abundant promise of power, and power is essential in the national plans for heavy industry and future growth. Here in Brazil, also in Argentina and Mexico, is a growing base of heavy industry. For Latin America, it means a start towards industrial independence. Up to now, Latin American states must depend on costly imports from abroad in steel, machine tools, power-generating heavy electrical equipment. Until it's possible to make these things within the region, the struggle to grow and plan and pay the way may end in tragic failure. Latin America's needs far outstrip her rate of industrial growth. Only massive foreign aid, investment, capital assistance can meet the needs. And help on this scale must come from the United States or international agencies like the United Nations. A vital source of capital has been investment by foreign companies who build branch factories and assembly plants in many areas. European cars are now produced in Argentina and Brazil, as well as heavier types of transport. Besides investment capital, the foreign firms who build Latin American subsidiaries bring something else of value. Skilled personnel who come from abroad hand on their technical and managerial skills to Latin Americans. Without these skills, the plans for industrialization could not succeed. Throughout Latin America, the bustling cities display their new industrial growth. Skyscrapers downtown, and in the suburbs, new houses for a new class of people. Managers, bureaucrats, entrepreneurs, professional men. These people form a new middle class in Latin America's social structure, which up to now, by and large, was dominated by the old privileged families. Some of the new wealth filters down to the working class, but their share is small. The really good schools, like the really good houses, are mostly reserved for the wealthier upper and middle classes. For their children, the future holds increasing opportunities. Yet it isn't just the wealthy who have ambitions. There's new concern with education on the part of adults as well as children. There's awareness of the fact that many new possibilities are open to the ordinary citizen with education, no matter what his or her rank. In Brazil, an election. On the surface, it resembles voting in North America. There's the orderly casting of ballots, the patient queue outside the polling station. But behind all Latin American politics, there's a passion, a volatility unknown in northern climes. Argentina, furor in the streets. Army officers have staged a coup and overthrown a government. And here's another aspect of Latin American politics: persistent interference by the military. Often the will of the people counts for nothing. A government may be elected democratically, but if the army disapproves, it may end abruptly. With constant meddling by the military, there's no assurance of any smooth transition from one government to the next. Always there's uncertainty, the chance of sudden arbitrary acts, like that against President Manuel Prado of Peru. July 1962, the president arrested by military leaders who then seized power. This was a setback for democracy. For the people, there's great frustration at this contempt for democratic rule. At each setback, they demonstrate and protest. But in the end, the last word rests with the army. Traditional in Latin American politics is the image of the strong man, the dictator. He may be overthrown, but when he falls, he leaves behind a political vacuum. The army can maintain order, but it's seldom likely to favor social change and progress. Juan Perón of Argentina. Like all dictators who were thrown out of their country, he left his with a legacy of troubles. Perón differed from other strong men by winning support from the workers and trade unions, lavishing such benefits upon them in his reckless rule that he impoverished a once wealthy nation. Havana, Cuba, and a revolution that would electrify the Western Hemisphere. To the outside world, Havana formerly was a tourist playground, modern and prosperous. Behind this facade, there was grinding poverty, the classic breeding ground for revolution. Years of pent-up bitterness inflamed Fidel Castro's revolution against the Batista dictatorship. There was hatred of feudal landlords, hatred of foreign companies who supported the dictatorship and controlled much of the economy. There was long-standing Marxist organization, strengthened by years of struggle. Other Latin American states look to Cuba and Castro with misgiving. They know the same conditions that led to Castroism are present in their own countries. Feudalism, thwarted pride, frustration at their own repeated failure to solve their problems. Can they accomplish what they have to do before the pressure becomes too great, the hour too late? Mexico's revolution has achieved reforms and progress, along with stable government. Back in 1910, under the iron grip of a long-time dictator, Porfirio Diaz, a revolution seemed wholly unlikely. But despite the dictator's apparent strength, unrest was there. Resentment against the feudal order, against dictatorship. And in 1911, bloody revolution broke out. All over Mexico, rebellions flared like grass fires in spontaneous local risings. There was no one central leader, but several local ones, each of them rallying the oppressed and downtrodden of his area. Many were Indians, rising against the wealthy Spanish families. One of the most famous was Pancho Villa, scourge of the northern ranchers and the great estates. It took about 6 months to overthrow the dictator. In June 1911, Francisco Madero, a champion of constitutional freedom, entered Mexico City as first elected president. Despite the joy of the city populace, the aims of revolution had barely begun to be accomplished. For 10 more years, there would be savage fighting between the revolutionary factions themselves, plus a continuing struggle with their old-time enemies. Throughout the 1920s into the 30s, the spirit of the revolution burned, with new reforms coming in quick succession. If at times the zeal of the leaders seemed to flag, popular outcry drove them on. The extreme left wing was prominent in the revolution, but never took control. President Lázaro Cárdenas, with his election in 1934, began an era of consolidation in Mexico's continuing revolution. In the 1930s, even the army helped to carry out campaigns of literacy. In the villages, army men taught reading and writing. Literacy, for all the submerged millions among the Indian peasants, was a major goal of the revolutionary program. Land reforms were carried out under Cárdenas. Redistribution of the land had been begun earlier, but now the tempo stepped up. There were many problems: not enough land to go around, poor soil, a desperate need for modern tools and farm machinery, and above all, the need for capital. But more and more land titles were passing over to the peasants. Under Cárdenas, some 25 million acres, redistributed in about 3 years. The old, inequitable system of the great estates was ending. More land was needed, more crops and food. But now at least the farmer could clear his land, knowing that its yield belonged to him and his family, and not to a landlord. To aid the farmer, the revolution had to provide other benefits as well. New irrigation systems to water the dry land, new bridges, highways, water systems, sewers. All these were part of Mexico's huge effort to raise up the mass of her people from poverty to productivity. Oil, as it happened, was one of Mexico's richest resources. Formerly, it was controlled by foreign companies. The revolution determined to end their control. In 1938, Mexico expropriated the oil industry. From the public, especially the labor movement, came passionate approval. The expropriation shocked the international business community. There were boycotts and reprisal. Oil production dropped alarmingly. Nationalist feelings had been gratified, but the cost was great. In village Mexico, many reforms were due. Under the old system, based on Spanish rule, there was little self-government at the local level. Now, to deal with their own local problems, village councils were formed. These councils were an echo of the Indian past. Strong local government of this type had long ago existed among the Aztec Indians before the Spaniards came to Mexico. Reforms or no, poverty still remains. There is much to do before the continuing revolution is complete. By 1957, Mexicans could celebrate the 100th anniversary of their basic constitution. They could look back on the century with pride. They had overthrown, long since, the dictator who betrayed their liberal constitution. And since that overthrow, Mexico had built out of her revolution a stable yet dynamic modern state. Her progress was not in material things alone. The climate of the revolution fostered a great awakening of the arts, especially painting and architecture. Bold new motifs drawn from the Indian past enriched the public buildings. The art of Mexico won the world's acclaim. Can Mexico's story be repeated in the other states of Latin America? All of them share the same hopes, same needs, the same frustrations. All of them share a history rooted in imperial Spain or Portugal, and before that, in Indian civilization. Can all these countries find the way to build their new society, free from the burdens of the past?